Equity Law. Ray Dalio's concept of the big cycle is dominating discussions.
Welcome to Reality Check for the year 2026. Right now, the global economy is sitting on a staggering 348 US dollars trillion in total debt. In the United States, the national debt has breached 38.5 US dollars trillion, and we are running structural deficits of nearly $2 trillion a year. But numbers this large lose their meaning to the average person. To truly understand what is happening to the global economy and how the explosive events in the Middle East are accelerating a massive financial reckoning, we have to understand how countries actually go broke. Today, we are going to look at the mechanics of the big debt cycle, explore the stark mathematical reality of the 2026 economy, and explain why holding government debt might be the riskiest financial decision of the decade. To understand sovereign debt, we first have to shatter the illusion of what going broke actually means. When a household or a corporation runs out of money, they default. They declare bankruptcy and their assets are liquidated. But a central government that issues debt in its own fiat currency plays by an entirely different set of rules. Because governments possess a central bank, they can simply print more money to service their debts. Credit rating agencies often miss this crucial nuance, focusing only on the risk of an outright default. But for a nation like the United States, the real risk is not default. The real risk is devaluation. The government will always ensure you get your money back, but by the time you get it, that money will buy you significantly less. This dynamic is driven by what macroeconomic historians call the big debt cycle. We are all familiar with short-term business cycles, the typical 6 to 8 year periods of expansion and recession. But over decades, these short-term cycles accumulate into a massive, long-term debt cycle lasting roughly 80 years. Because credit feels like an economic stimulant, politicians and central bankers have a systemic bias toward creating it. Over a lifetime, debts continually outpace incomes until the entire system reaches absolute saturation. Historically, this cycle progresses through 5 distinct stages. Stage 1 is sound money, where debt is low and credit fuels genuine, real-world productivity. Stage 2 is the debt bubble, where euphoria sets in and massive paper wealth is created out of thin air. Stage 3 is the top, the moment the immense debt burden becomes mathematically unsustainable. Today, in 2026, we are deep into stage 4, the deleveraging. This is the painful unwinding where growth stalls, interest rates become weaponized, and central banks are forced to intervene massively. Eventually, this leads to stage 5, the new equilibrium, where old debts are wiped out or inflated away, and a new financial standard is born. To understand why this happens, we must look at the mechanics of the economic machine. Traditional economists focus on supply and demand in terms of quantity, but the reality of markets is determined purely by spending. Credit is simply a promise to pay. It can be created out of thin air, instantly increasing spending power today, but leaving a lingering obligation for tomorrow. When a central bank pumps trillions in credit into the system, as we saw POST 2020, without the real economy producing more actual goods, the mathematical result is purely inflation. This dynamic fundamentally altered sovereign debt math, leading us to the crisis we face today. How do we know we are hitting the limits of this cycle? A policy analyst must look at 4 key indicators that force a central bank into an impossible corner. First, debt to income. How massive is the total debt relative to national tax revenues? Second, debt service. What percentage of revenue is eaten up strictly by paying interest on old debt? Third, real interest rates. Are interest rates higher than economic growth? If so, debt compounds uncontrollably. And fourth, savings reserves. Does the country have liquid reserves to draw upon during a shock? When these indicators flash red, the system is approaching a breaking point. Applying these indicators to the United States in early 2026 reveals a terrifying mathematical reality. USA national debt has reached 38.5 US dollars trillion. According to the latest Congressional Budget Office projections, federal debt held by the public will soon reach a record 120% of gross domestic product, eclipsing the previous high set just after World War I. Central government debt is roughly 508% of revenue. Even worse, USA is running an annual deficit of 1.9 US dollars trillion, and they are now borrowing 20% of our income simply to pay the interest on our old debt. This creates the ultimate central bank dilemma. The US Treasury must issue trillions in bonds just to fund its deficit and keep the government running. But what happens if private investors refuse to buy them? To attract buyers, the government must raise interest rates. However, higher rates will instantly crash their heavily leveraged economy and cause our interest payments to explode. The inevitable alternative is that the central bank steps in as the buyer of last resort, printing money to purchase the debt. This caps interest rates, but it drastically devalues the dollar and destroys the purchasing power of the middle class. Policymakers have to navigate two opposing forces to solve this. On one side are deflationary forces, austerity and defaults. Slashing government spending reduces the debt burden, but it acts as a massive depressant, slowing the economy and increasing political strife. On the other side are inflationary forces, money printing and monetization. Injecting liquidity eases the debt burden but rapidly devalues the currency. The goal is to achieve what is known as a beautiful deleveraging. This occurs when policymakers perfectly balance these forces, printing just enough money to keep nominal economic growth slightly above interest rates, slowly shrinking the debt burden over time without triggering a depression. But economics does not happen in a vacuum. The big debt cycle is colliding with a fierce geopolitical overlay. Right now, the debt squeeze is interacting with massive internal political polarization, acts of nature, and rapid AI advancements. Most critically, it is colliding with external geopolitical tensions. In February 2026, the US and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran, dramatically escalating conflict in the Middle East. In retaliation, threats to close the Strait of Hormuz have sent shockwaves through global energy markets. If oil prices surge to 100 US dollars or even 140 US dollars a barrel, the resulting inflation will prevent the Federal Reserve from lowering interest rates, trapping the US government in a debt spiral that it cannot escape without massive money printing. So how does this end? To stabilize the 2026 debt burden, the US would need to execute a 3% 3 PART solution, cutting spending, raising taxes, and lowering interest rates. But politically, true austerity is unpopular and massive wealth transfers are politically difficult. Furthermore, hard defaults would cause an economic collapse. Therefore, historically, policymakers overwhelmingly choose the path of least resistance, monetizing the debt. They will print the money, they will devalue the currency. It is the only politically viable way out of a 38.5 US dollars trillion hole. The conclusion is mathematically inevitable. Holding government fiat debt in this environment is a guaranteed loss of purchasing power. To protect yourself, you must diversify into hard assets that hold real, intrinsic value. You must monitor the Federal Reserve's balance sheet actions closely, watching for the moment they pivot back to massive quantitative easing. Finally, prepare for sustained, sticky inflation as the new equilibrium of the global economy. The world order is changing, and understanding this cycle is your best defense. Thank you for watching.